Welcome to a special edition of the Weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. This is a year-end special between Christmas and New Year's. We've been talking for a few weeks about doing a top 10 list of all the wild gender stories that we've seen in the last 12 months. Pretty typical of this time of year. I think for most of us, I'm looking ahead at the new year and thinking about some New Year's resolutions and some goals, and looking back over the last, going, what has happened. When you're thinking about this stuff, Melanie, where were you a year ago? What were you thinking, seeing? What was your?
For me, it's been an interesting year because at this time last year, around December, I was definitely aware that there were many issues, but I was detached from the reality in my day-to-day life. I wasn't very confident speaking about it publicly, although I was having some conversations with people in my life, for example, my trainer, but it felt like it was very much in secret. I felt very much like it had to be kept secret. And it wasn't until much later in the year that I decided to come out publicly and be a bit of a face for it. But yeah, this time last year, I was very isolated. So yeah, for me, it's been a bit of a ride for that. And now just trying to get as much information out there as possible. What were you doing last year?
Well, I was. We were on the tail of the Ontario, BC, and Manitoba School Board elections, which were late October. I met a ton of amazing people through that campaign, and really enhanced some relationships that I had with people in the Lighthouse Network, for example. I started writing for Woke Watch Canada. I put up a couple pieces. One on one I'm still really proud of. On Indigenous oral tradition, and how we relate in the current zeitgeist to Indigenous tradition in Canada, and I think we're a long way off. But I was starting to see enough pattern in public media that I felt like writing a media critique and starting a blog that we ended up calling the Weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report was a good place to apply some energy. So I'd been public for a number of months, almost a year actually, prior. But a lot of people are like you, kind of in secret, afraid to, stick our heads up above the parapet to ask questions. Don't know who to talk to about this, who a safe person is, where you're not going to get canceled. So I think a lot of people still bear some of that. But we're going to talk a little bit about how that shifted in the last year. Now, we talked about a top 10, and I don't know if we can really put it in those concise terms, but as we were gathering up the stories that have emerged in the last year, some patterns emerged. And I want to start with, I'm going to share my screen here. We put together a PowerPoint. This was the cover of the first edition of the Weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. And the big story, January 14th, a National Post article on the parents' rights frustration that many parents are feeling in the name of gender identity. And I think that this was an editorial, if I'm not mistaken, that National Post View. It set the theme, or it identified the theme for the year that was probably the strongest. And we're going to get to what you think the number one story is, but we're along these lines. So we started to see, that you mentioned that feeling of isolation and being alone.
Yeah.
In the mid-year, I think one of the biggest stories, and what I wanted to use to frame our exploration today, was these polls that came out from Angus Reid. And we started to see some polls in the spring about parents and Canadians' views in general about secret social transition at school. For viewers who are kind of new to the language, a social transition is the change of name, pronouns, and dress based on gender identity. And schools have been and still do defend the practice of keeping this a secret from parents in the name of so-called safety, which is just a set of feelings that they've identified that people might have. And what we know is that the public opinion is largely on the side of transparency on these issues. 78% of respondents, according to Angus and Reid, did not support keeping this secret, and only about 14% of the population does. And that ties to, we've talked about this a lot this year, I think, Melanie. These zealous activists. This is, again, Angus Reid. It's the Canadian cultural mindsets, where they broke out kind of belief patterns and political ideologies based on these 5 categories, and identified the zealous activists driving some of this culture war stuff.
Yeah, they would be the most active defendants of progressive ideology. So intersectionality, anti-racism, DEI, gender ideology. So those kinds of things, those would be the people on the forefront fighting for it to become embedded in every area of society.
There was a significant survey last year, 2022, about pronoun usage. Again, it was published in the National Post, and it was shocking to me that, like, I think it was 9% of the population feel that the use of pronouns should be compelled. This is straight up compelled speech. You must say these things. And those people fall into that. The number 14%, 17%, those keep coming up over and over again.
I just wanted to say that when we're talking about the isolation, certainly the feeling that I had, I don't think was uncommon, where at first you don't think any of this stuff is really happening and you think it's all exaggerated. But then when you realize some of this stuff is happening, you're like, oh, well, I better not say anything, because if I say something, maybe that's not acceptable. But then maybe you start saying something, maybe to a good friend or somebody close to you in your life, and maybe that person also agrees with you. And so you think, oh, well, maybe it's not just me, but you think you've got a secret little society of 2 people agree and nobody else does on the outside. But the more you talk about it, the more you realize that actually a lot of people agree with you. I mean, you come out the other end, and when you're trying to fight this, another thing you realize is that there are definite institutional barriers that are creating laws and policies to stop anyone fighting back. But that's a whole other story. But surely, you coming out of that isolation, a lot of people who are more in the middle of here, these maybe conflicted middle people, or maybe some people on either one of those sides, maybe coming out of their isolation a little bit.
Yeah, it felt a year ago, after those, we took just a real tarring and feathering in the media. Those of us who ran for school board, we were called every pejorative term, right? Bigots, racists, transphobic, hatred, all alt-right, even Fox News
and that gets
viewer.
seen by people like me. People like me, or the isolated people, or people who are not really involved, definitely see that. And I think that you tend to think everyone gets treated like that if they speak out. I think that's definitely...
And really, when you look at the graph here, it's like, this is not everyone. This is a small percentage of people. They seem to hold a disproportionate amount of power. But it really, that sense of isolation. And I'm reminded, I mentioned before that I grew up in an abusive household. And one of the things that in these kinds of toxic environments that people do is they control the information to such a degree that you think it's normal. And that, that's just the way the rest of the world is. And, so when the abuser says, well, all those people think you're a terrible person, and you'd be surprised what people are saying about you, they're using a false sense, of the world to weave a narrative of reality that's not real. Okay, so again, this is Angus Reid, and we in our pre-production, we talked about this, and I got the numbers mixed up. 52% of people in Canada don't like the idea of canceling somebody for their speech.
Let's just read the graph first. What is it saying? It's saying, what's your overall view of this trend? Public figures. Oh, so basically it's asking what people feel that being canceled is. And in red, the people agree with the statement that suppressing free speech is good in the name of political correctness. So that's what canceling is. And then the people in blue agree with the statement, an important way to ensure public figures are accountable for their behavior. So it's whether or not you believe that cancellation is good for making people accountable for their behavior, or whether or not it's about suppressing free speech in the name of political correctness. And so you have the males on one side, the females on another side in different age categories. But in total, it's basically saying that 52% of the people believe that cancellation is suppressing free speech. So just
Yeah.
a little bit more than half of the surveyed population
Which
here.
in itself is shocking, right? It's amazing
Yeah.
that 48% of people would think that cancellation and the kinds of tactics that go along with cancellation is a justifiable set of tactics. And we see
Yeah.
in the broken down by age cohort what was this group again? The zealous activists. I feel like I have to write that down. The zealous activists are more likely to be women under 35, and we can see that reflected in the graph here, where we're north of 60%, or 6 in 10 women between 18 and 35 believe that cancellation is an appropriate tactic, and it really does. When you look at it, how do you know who's right? Who appoints these people as the arbiters of speech?
Well, it's curious that the women on this graph generally sort of agree with cancellation as a means of political action, basically of keeping people accountable for their behavior.
Yeah.
But the men don't. The men don't see that. They see it as a suppression of free speech. So I don't know if that has any kind of meaning behind it, but that's interesting. An interesting observation from this data.
I mean, what we're talking about in other language is trait typical female aggression. It's mean girl tactics. It's using social coercion, social pressure, and reputational destruction and attacks in order to manipulate people in the environment. So, we're seeing these, that's not the language Angus Reid is using, but we're seeing this isolation that people like us have felt, and alienation, and we're then seeing the patterns of behavior, kind of worked out statistically. Then they break down this, and this is really quite shocking. Those zealous activists, 95% of those zealous activists believe that these cancellation tactics are an important way to ensure public figures are accountable for their behavior. So there's that social aggression, that trait typical female aggression, and reputational attacks and destruction. And you really see a striking change in position. A couple of decades ago, like I remember in the early 90s and through the early aughts, there was this big conversation in the US, particularly about rap music and the misogyny in rap music and wanting to censor and label and explicit lyrics, et cetera, et cetera. Eminem came under fire at the turn of the century around this stuff. And it was people from the right who were wanting to silence speech that they thought was dangerous or destructive. And now we've got a complete reversal. The people more who are historically or traditionally on the right, and I come from the left, and you do as well. But I fit into this room where I think that, as a defiant objector, you're not going to tell me what I can say or must say, and you're not going to tell me what I can't say. I'm going to speak the truth, and I'm going to seek the truth. And for some reason, the zealous activists feel like it's their self-appointed authority to control what other people say.
A couple observations in this data here too is that the inverse is true. It's flipped over in the defiant objectors. So 95 seeing it as cancellation as suppression of free speech, and that 5% as a means of accountability. So there's this flip here. But also what's interesting is that when you're in groups of people that overwhelmingly, and we tend to associate with people who are similar to us, generally speaking, but when you're in a group of people that overwhelmingly 95% agree on something, that can create echo chambers, and you can sort of think everybody believes the same thing too. So that's interesting, because it's not just the zealous activists believing that cancellation of people for believing in biology is okay, but then you might have some issues on the other end as well. So that's an interesting observation in this data for me.
Now, not long ago, so I zoomed in on these categories and the percentages, and I did that because I want to juxtapose this in the next slide. Not long ago, you posted a series of tweets about the bell curve and statistical distribution and standard deviation. Now, those are terms that I haven't really refreshed since I was in undergrad humanities statistical research and a little bit in my world in finance and investments. And I was struck by the pattern here. Not totally sure if it's right to describe it this way, but when we look at this is the bell curve. And we can see in the middle, we have the mean or the middle of normal. This is called normal distribution. I think you stressed that. And we have this 34% on either side of the mean, or 68% is in the middle of the normal distribution. And then we have the tails. Am I on the right track with explaining this, Melanie?
Let me just go over
if we're looking at a population.
This is super basic information that sometimes people need a refresher on, because like you said, it's sometimes we forget stuff like that. It is a normal distribution. It's common in all kinds of sciences, finance, social sciences. It's the very basics of understanding data distribution. And you have the mean, which is your average, which is a line in the middle. And if you go one standard deviation away from that mean, which is the average, then you get about 60. Well, one standard deviation either way gets about 68% of that data range in a normal distribution. And as you go through the standard deviations, you have more and more of that data captured in the sample. So this would appear. A standard example of this would be heights within a population, right? And so with human heights, the mean is where most people will fall, somewhere around the mean, and within one standard deviation, most people in a population will be about that height. I think for males, it's 5'10" around in Canada, and for women, it's maybe 5'5", something like that. And then as you go farther away from that average height, you might get the really tall people, like the 6'5" people who are in the third standard deviation, or the 99% range. So that the tail ends, the marginal ends, basically. So we have the normal distribution where most people fall, and then you have the marginal tail ends. Does that give it a bit of an overview?
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Height, weight, certain behaviors, and anyway, when I look at this graph and I look at the numbers, if I add in my head, 2% and 13% is 15, we're at about 16% for these, one side of the distribution, and then we see this population of about 17% of Canadians fall into this zealous activist category. Suggests to me that there's, we might view it in this way. Probably someone who's more versed in statistics might sharpen their pencil on this and either break these categories out a little bit more, or tell me where my thinking is wrong.
I mean, to know if we were accurate in this observation, yes, I think you'd have to do some kind of statistical analysis with the data. But it could be that the data follows a normal distribution like that, because it's very, very common for all samples, or most samples in populations, to follow a normal distribution. I think it might be the most common distribution of data. So, I mean, that could track.
So, like part of this to me is, that feeling that we were talking about of being isolated and not sure who we can talk to, and seeming like the world is, this is the way the world thinks, and we just kind of got to go along with it. But really, a lot of this is coming out of, I suspect if we break down those zealous activists, there are going to be some really hardcore people that are maybe 20% of that population, or so, that are really driving all of it. And we're looking at the extremes trying to run the middle. So I wanted to use that as a frame for this. You've got something to say. You got that.
Well, it just occurred to me that we talk about normal and normativity, and I think this has a lot to do with a normal distribution of population. So we talk about normal a lot, and because it does follow it. If it's normal, it's because it's near the mean, right? That's what kind of what we're saying. And so you have the marginal ends, which are the abnormal or marginal. And a lot of these zealous activists will talk about centering the marginal. And when they talk about centering the marginal, in my mind, that's what appears in my head, is this taking the tail ends of a normal distribution and shoving it into the middle. So, it wouldn't surprise me if the data did fit this distribution, because that's what they're doing. They're taking this marginal way of looking at the world and forcing it into the normative or first standard deviation range. But anyway, I digress. Yeah. Please carry on.
So I wanted to frame this sort of year in review with some of that revelation, some of that, I think a lot more people are waking up to this and realizing, hey, not everybody thinks the way that these zealous activists think, but they seem to be, in control of a whole lot of stuff. And another thing that we started seeing, not just this year, but we saw more of it this year, was that think tanks in Canada and not just the media, but think tanks are writing about these issues, the culture war issues, the gender issues, the education issues. Those are quite significant ones. Fraser Institute is a a long has a long history in Canada. They're right of center think tank from British Columbia. And they publish articles on all kinds of things. We've got Macdonald Laurier, which characterizes itself. Sir John A. Macdonald and Wilfrid Laurier were, one was conservative, one was liberal. They were opposite sides of the House. Macdonald Laurier kind of brings those two sets of ideas together to try and create a truly nonpartisan think tank. And they put up some articles as well about flags and gender and education and things like that. They take a bit of heat for doing it from their donor base, and it's costly for them to do so, but it's important for people to be informed in research by highly credible writers who are putting these things up. And so we started to see some of that. So these concerns are very mainstream, is what I'm trying to share with audience. This isn't, although it's difficult for us to get traction in public media and in the dominant discourse, these concerns are very normal, very, very mainstream, very real, and not to be stigmatized. We shouldn't let these loudmouth bullies push us around, because history and facts and the distribution of ideas is, kind of supports where we're at now. This is another thing we saw this year. I didn't do a big mashup slide, but we're getting this rhetoric about importing American-style MAGA politics and outrage politics from the U.S. into Canada. And it's coming from the woke, and it's coming from the liberals. And in an attempt to associate these things with Donald Trump or with, I don't know,
well, it's about
American
the boogeyman, the conservative boogeyman. That's what it is. And it wouldn't work if it wasn't effective. As someone, and you say I was on the left, I was on the progressive left. And I can tell you that is a very effective way to thought stop people, to get them to stop their own thoughts as if they fear that something might be right wing, not even extreme right wing or some of the most marginal thoughts in that or ideas in that area, just right wing, just conservative, somehow then becomes this evil boogeyman. You've seen this march of this idea of the evil boogeyman conservative ideas, and that's all you need to label it as, and people run screaming from ideas and will not look at them, will not engage with them. So a very effective tactic from the liberals.
It's one of those, as we opened, it's one of those things that isolates people into believing that their ideas aren't normal or not shared by a lot of people. And in fact, it's propaganda is what it is, because Canadian parents, look, we didn't import this guy from the United States. His boobs were imported from Taiwan or a factory in China somewhere. This is homegrown, real Canadian shop class, apparently. This story carried over from 2022. You can't miss them. It kind of took.
I don't think anyone can miss them. They've been all over the world.
We got some resolution in September. So this guy, Lemieux, has taken off the prosthetics, and he's teaching in Hamilton now. Nobody really knows what kind of deals were made on this issue, but he has stopped wearing the prosthetics.
A lot of controversy with Kayla Lemieux as well. People not knowing whether or not Kayla was a troll, a very, very determined troll, or someone who genuinely felt that they'd become trans. I don't know about you, Shannon, but I really, truly like to believe that Kayla Lemieux was just a very, very determined troll. What do you think?
I don't know if we'll ever know. It's one of those, even if he comes out at some point and says, yes, I was trolling you, that itself could be a troll. Or if he says, no, that was real, we're not going to know the truth.
Yeah.
And I think it's better that way. There's a lot of stuff that's happening in the public sphere in Canada. We didn't have to import from anywhere, but some of these propagandists love to try and make the associations. The school books and libraries, another one. There are very sexually explicit books in middle school libraries in Canada. There are ones that are being, given to young children, and we'll talk a little bit about.
But it's not immoral if it's on the left, Shannon. Get with the times.
Right. Yeah. Well, we didn't. That's not that kind of community sensibility and desire to protect children isn't imported from the MAGA right in the United States. That's just good centrist values. And so, these attempts at minimizing and marginalizing mainstream opinions is starting to run out of steam. And it's helpful that we see the kind of craziness. I mean, the school boards was a giant theme across the country this year. British Columbia, it looks like they're protesting 24 hours a day. Like they've had an ongoing protest in Rachna Singh's riding, the BC education minister.
Well, they have
for weeks.
Actually. I think it's day 4 of a 7-day, 24-hour protest. So they are actually protesting 24/7. I think in shifts in Abbotsford, and these are the same group of parents that have been protesting on a daily basis since I think the spring.
For weeks and weeks and weeks. Yeah,
and oddly enough, they're not covered in the mainstream papers. Really, I mean, there was an article recently covering it in the CBC, which was less than fair. But it's not really being covered.
We have all kinds of a couple of the images here. The Hamilton School Board, you can see with the police standing outside the school board meetings. School board meetings were shut down in the spring. Windsor was another school board that was shut down. The Kayla Lemieux thing in Halton region, they started restricting the number of people who could go and attend. They were turning people away from the doors. The trans activists were getting there hours early and filling up the galleries so no one else could get in. They did the same thing in Ottawa when I gave a delegation to the board in March, trying to play themselves as victims.
Like to me, as I guess an outsider kind of coming in this year, it felt like with the school board stuff that more as regular citizens became more aware of what was going on in their own children's schools. And I think that kind of happened through the pandemic. They started seeing what was being taught, then started becoming more engaged in local politics, maybe started going to parent council, started going to school board meetings. And as they got pushed out, then more parents learned about what was going on because it was on social media. And the more parents said, this isn't okay, the more the school boards shut parents out, and the more parents got shut out, more parents would show up to actually say something. And so it's kind of like a Barbara Streisand effect that the more you want to get rid of this story, the more the story pops up. And so I feel like that's kind of been a trend that's been going on this year, which I'm not sure has let up much. We'll see how that continues next year.
No, it seems to be building, and I mean where it's at now in BC with an attempt to recall the education minister, and weeks and weeks of consistent protests. This has become
because the framing is that conservative, they're evil conservatives who, they're bigots and transphobes and all this, thought-stopping accusations. But it's not working. It's not working.
Indeed, yeah. We had the stuff going on in BC, but one of the themes that came out starting in June, actually earlier this year, the first was a London, Ontario school where on a rainbow day, whether it was the Pink Shirt Day or Day of Remembrance or Trans Women's Day, whatever, half the year is pretty much a rainbow celebration now. A London school with a high Muslim population kept about 70% of the kids out of school for the Rainbow Activist Day. That caught some imagination, and it actually wasn't the first case of this. In June of 2022, an Ottawa school called Vimy Ridge, a K-8 school, about 70% of the kids stayed home for the raising of the Pride flag and the Pride Celebration Day in June. And this has turned out to be a good strategy, and particularly on the 1st of June was a big one, coordinated between Campaign Life Coalition, Action for Canada, and Muslim organizations across the country, which I suspect in this coming year is going to be even bigger. A way to send a message is to keep kids home, and we're starting to see some real pushback on. I think it's more so in the States where the pushback has bigger traction, but we're starting to see pushback against flags. So the town of
Norwich. There's a town of Norwich who banned. I think they banned the flag specifically, the Pride Progress flag. Obviously, the York Catholic District School Board also voted to ban the Pride Progress Pride flag, not the Pride flag, as far as I'm aware. Or maybe they have. Anyway, but also an interesting one that happened recently that we covered was Windsor decided to ban all flags that are not municipal and federal flags. So when they're being inclusive of getting rid of non-citizenry flags, which is an interesting tactic in itself.
Yeah, which is, yeah, I think it's great. It's showing good direction on this. Now, I mentioned briefly, along with school board ethics, that I gave a delegation. This was in March after a gentleman by the name of Nick Morabito was censored and defamed by the acting school board chair at the time. It was Nili Kaplan-Myrth, the notorious Nutty Nili, who just was censured and suspended by the school board for her outrageous behavior. I gave a 3.5 minute talk on free speech and why government actors or state actors, which is school board, can't go around censoring parents. Right, that's the whole reason that we have Article 2B in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is to prevent the government from telling people what they must say or stopping them from saying what they need to say. It's to allow free and open criticism of the government. But the activists, the zealots, brought out their rainbow mob, and they used these tactics. As I mentioned in this standard school board playbook, they limited people in the gallery. The rainbow activists got there super early, and they took up all the seats. They protested outside. I think there was 4 assaults at this particular event, and I didn't say anything about trans people at all. Nevertheless, they whipped up their propaganda mob, the anti-hate people, to come out and intimidate anyone who doesn't, toe their line. All right, so this is some of the reason why people are speaking out. But another theme that emerged, right? And this one is unsurprising. The theme is that self-identification causes problems and allows sexual predators under laws that give them the right to say I'm a woman and access women's spaces to abuse those loopholes. And the
Well, a
Orlando
lot of
guy.
people have been saying, and not just that, a lot of people point out that trans rights are human rights, that what that really means is trans rights are special privileges. And when you allow people to have special privileges under the law, some people are going to take advantage of that, especially if you can self-ID into those
100%.
special privileges categories. And I think this theme of, what did we originally call it? I think it was Peepers.
Flashers and
I can't
perverts.
remember. Yeah, something equally like that. Kind of shows that pattern of individuals who see an opportunity to cheat, because this is what they're doing. They're cheating, and benefit themselves for doing so. Yeah, so there's been quite a few of those stories this year.
What's the one that got you?
Well, the one that got me the most for some reason was this this Edmonton offender. I can't remember, Waskahat, I think their name is. They're at the bottom right corner here.
Yeah.
And I think it was egregious in particular for me, not just because it was recent, but it was this particular individual who didn't identify as being trans previously, had a long history of child abuse, being in possession of child abuse material, egregious stuff of toddler-aged children, was known to the police, had been apprehended and decided to change their gender identity to female. The Edmonton police knew that they were going to release them into the public sphere, put out a letter saying, this person's going out into the community. They're a danger to the community, by the way, warning, warning. They're likely to offend in this way, and then just release them. And lo and behold, a few days later, the person had been a danger to the community. They had, I think, a crib or a pushchair in their possession. They had child abuse material in their possession. They did exactly what the police said that they were that they were likely to do. So for me, that was probably the most egregious this year, because it was like the police know that they're going to offend again, and the victims of this person's crimes are babies and very small children. So I'm still shocked by this particular story. I think they're in custody again at the minute.
Yeah,
It's an ongoing
he
story.
was picked up again. I mean, there's a couple layers to this. One is we don't have, for viewers who don't realize this, perhaps we don't have equal justice before the law in Canada anymore. We have intersectional race politics that are inserting themselves in bail hearings, and in conviction and in sentencing. So based on historic injustice and oppression and where you are on the intersectional matrix, and what I mean by that is if you have an intersection of various protected categories, in the case of this Weskahat guy from Edmonton, a trans woman is basically the most marginal of identities that there is. So marginalized that they really didn't exist before about 50 years ago in any kind of meaningful public way. And also Indigenous, and so you add in there, some crying about, I was an abused child, and the court system basically has to grant bail. They have to give more lenient sentences based on the weight of these intersectional categories. And it's giving even more loopholes. So this is probably one of the reasons why this guy decides to identify this way, because it's going to get him a lighter sentence. This Redux article that Eva Kurlova wrote was about the guy in Nanaimo in January who was peeping in the Nanaimo Aquatic Center change rooms. Mama Bear escorted this guy out of the change room, and the police were threatening to charge her with assault, and they refused to do anything about this guy who was very obviously peeping on girls, young girls. And as it turns out, he's a convicted sex offender. So he's just changed his name. He's using a trans identity as a way to protect himself and to insinuate himself into spaces where he might have access to young girls. And it's really quite frightening. We've got another, like, for some reason, Nanaimo and Vancouver Island seems to be a hotbed for this. Parksville is about 15 minutes north. We've got Bridget, who made the news for crying about not being allowed into women's change room at a private female-only gym, and that his human rights were being violated by not being allowed to go into those change rooms. And another kind of the same week in Saskatoon, and this was defended by municipal councillors who are saying this is the new normal. You just got to get used to it. The Shaw Centre, that is the Shaw Communications, a large Canadian telecom company, sponsors the name logo on this building, and these things are going on where in the Saskatoon case, an exhibitionist parading around naked. Again, we're talking about girls between 8 and 13 years old getting ready for swim class, and he's hanging out the twig and berries, and these, for some reason, we have allowed this trans legislation to make us overlook obvious predatory and antisocial behavior by these kinds of people.
Talking about this, I feel like my instinct is always to have a caveat saying, obviously, we don't mean all people who identify as trans are predators. But the point is that when you create laws like this, when you create these loopholes, then the people who are predators to begin with are going to be drawn to that get out of jail free card and that privilege point that they can get from those identities. And so it's curious to me that those who support this seem to be blind to this. They seem not to be able to make that distinction or to dot the I's and cross the T's in this area.
What's next? These are some of the activist crazies and the outrageous personalities that we've seen this year. On the right of your screen, Deanna Sharif, who was notorious here in Ottawa for being out at all the protests. This one was June the 9th. She became a meme, not just in Canada, but these crazy faces around the world. And then on the left, Anne, so-called Anne Andres, a male powerlifter who's a mediocre, weightlifter in the male category, is aiming to break a women's powerlifting world record because he can. And this has caused April Hutchinson, an actual competitive female powerlifter, to be suspended for 2 years from the Canadian Powerlifting Association. And this guy's just obnoxious. I've watched a couple of his videos and a real piece of work.
But I'm sure this is the same person that said if women had a problem with him participating in the women's category, that the women just had to train harder. They just have to train harder. They have to stop being transphobes and train harder.
Yeah. That's been a standard line. I've heard that from a couple of cycling men in the cycling category as well, who were dominating the podium and taking scholarships and prize money away from women who
Well, I love this
deserve
slide
to.
because then you have the Deannas or the Dinas, whatever your name is, love, the trans activists of the world, the rabid trans activists of the world, defending men who are basically mocking women and cheating and taking their titles like that. So I like this slide for that reason. It's really it's a really good representation of some of the cheaters and zealous activists in that category.
Yeah. Our notorious Nili here from Ottawa, school board trustee, just recently suspended for violating code of conduct, multiple violations of code. The less I see her, the better. Another big theme, we're not ranking these. We're probably at number 5 if we were to put numbers to them. But, one of the big things that came out this year was just how corrupt our institutions are with this ideology. Those zealous activists at 17% are punching above their weight in terms of the institutions they control. They very much
we've discovered how many of those zealous activists really have infiltrated some of the organizations that have power and really use that power for some of their more insane activism over the year. And you're right, the unions seem to be a really good example of that for sure. And some of these other organizations like Egale, like the 519, and it can show exactly how much damage these power-seeking zealots really can have.
Yeah. Well, when they're explicitly identifying, I had a conversation with somebody last week, and he was really, I mean, he tried the line, and it's so 2021 that they're not teaching critical race theory in public schools. I mean,
that's
like that it's to be able to say that with a straight face anymore, because it's so obvious. Anytime you have DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or anything that says social justice, this is all based on critical race theory and intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Historic oppression of oppressors by the oppressed, or oppression of the oppressed, the marginal. Right. We've got this thing that came up this year about decolonization that really showed the ugly side of what decolonization actually means. Settler colonialism, all of these buzzwords and jargon are behind these basically institutional mission statements, and the actions of people like Fred Hahn, who is the president of QP Ontario, and some of these organizations are all driven by this social justice ideology. They have basically declared the rest of us to be enemies for not agreeing with them.
Well, they've discovered that it's a very effective way to seize power, and it has been especially effective on the Canadian public to shut them up. Yeah. That's what I think.
Yeah. And it's, I love this one. The Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, the ETFO, across Canada and worldwide, what we are witnessing is an alarming trend in 2S LGBTQ+I hate, conservatism, and bigotry disguised as care for children or concern for children. Conservatism in the same sentence with bigotry and hate. So now this is the teachers union, and they give guidance to teachers. And so if teachers are being taught that conservatism is hatred and bigotry, and they're teaching this to children, just the fact that they're teaching that in school is alienating kids from their families and turning kids against the households that they're growing up in. So it's very, very frightening, the level of power and influence that these groups have.
Yeah.
And when it comes, this is setting up for the big union leak, because Fred Hahn got all kinds of notoriety around.
Oh, yeah. He's definitely become a well-known Canadian character for sure.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to carry on with Fred Hahn.
Oh, we can. Yeah. Where was
Just
he?
To let everyone watching know, this is sometimes as much as a surprise to me as it is to you, because Shannon did most of these, so I'm following along. I'm following the story.
So I'm pretty sure that we saw Fred Hahn in June in Ottawa.
Yes.
That was when Billboard Chris and Josh Alexander came to town. That's the day that I met you. I'm pretty sure that he was on one side of the line, but he hadn't broken through. But where he really broke through into public awareness was this Union League video.
Yes.
And his...
Although it's funny because he wasn't actually in it. I don't remember him actually being in it. But he is the president, and he did defend it.
So our friend Stuart Parker from BC, who's left he's living in exile now in Africa. Anyway, Stuart Parker, a long time, he had run for Premier of BC under the Green Party. I think that is part of his story. He was campaigning in the 80s against the styrofoam containers McDonald's was using. I mean, Stuart Parker has been a long-time political activist in British Columbia, and he put up a couple articles for the Macdonald Laurier Institute this year. This one was about that Union Lake. There was 100 and some people on that. It was a couple days before the September 20th Million March for Children, and it was kind of an emergency call to action by these union activists and these groups and organizers to try and confront the hatred and transphobia and inherent violence and whatever of parents who were trying to stand up for their rights and their obligations to protect their children from these dangerous and divisive ideologies.
That Union League call really didn't get, it got some traction in, I guess, more conservative media, as we can see here. I think they're both National Post, these ones.
Yep.
But it got very ignored by the left media in Canada. I don't remember it being covered by them at all. And I found that very curious because I thought if there was going to be a top 10, this league would be on that top 5 or maybe top 3, actually, because it was sensational leak of this group of union bosses, right? It's in it. They were that creepy, discussing amongst themselves for the most part in their very soft tones, but talking about the colonialism and the white supremacy and all of the horrible people. And really what they were doing is they were plotting together as union bosses with a lot of money and individuals behind them. I don't even know how many millions of people in Canada are part of these unions, but they were plotting against regular, everyday Canadians who didn't want their children to be exposed to sex at school or sexuality, right? I thought this was possible. This was definitely in my absolute tops this year, this very, very important leak. So if you haven't watched it, go watch it.
Yeah, it was quite sickening, as you're realizing just how many people they represent and the kind of influence and power they have. So the BC Teachers Union was quite effective in mobilizing people in the Vancouver protest. And 70-odd thousand teachers are members of the BC Teachers Federation. So a few emails connects to it's a platform to connect to a large audience of people. They're liars, right? They believe in using these tactics of social punishment and social aggression and character assassination and canceling people. They have no compunction about lying in order to get people to mobilize, trigger their emotions and get them outraged, to bring them out for their cause.
On a number of occasions in that leak, they actually made reference to some Marxist tactics, basically. And these tactics were basically
Beautiful trouble.
Control beautiful trouble, how to control the narrative, how to fight back, how to silence, how to intimidate, which are online. Beautiful Trouble is a collection of tactics that you can go read about. And that was one of them in there. So it is a treasure trove of basically proving the conspiracy theorists right. That's what I felt this one was.
Yeah. And this is something that Canadians are really waking up to. I'm trying to remember so lawsuits and legal was another big category or theme that emerged. Top right is Josh Alexander. He was expelled from his Catholic high school that's a little bit west of Ottawa for saying that God created man and woman. And he was outspoken about self-identifying boys accessing women's spaces and playing sports. And I think it was in a math class that was kind of the final straw. He had some appeals along the way, and most recently had some hearings as to whether or not he could complete his high school education in the system. He's aged out, unfortunately, from one way of looking at things, but he's still fighting to have his rights respected, to rights in a Catholic school, to believe in the creation of man and woman in a biblical sense. It seems crazy that they would be suspending him, but as we saw and have seen, institutions are captured. Carolyn Burjoski, top middle, had a recent victory and a recent loss. the Waterloo District School Board and the defendant who she's suing for defamation tried to have her case dismissed using a kind of an esoteric legal argument called anti-SLAPP. And that was struck down, so her case for defamation can proceed. But she had tried to get a judicial review of the decision by the school board chair to censor her in the school board meeting and prevent her from speaking. And that was the judge declined to hold the school board accountable for what they did. Said the school board was allowed to do this. Our friend Michelle Alva suing the medical system. She's a person who has autism and has had some other mental health issues, and was kind of one of the early people who were rushed through the medical system without evaluation and therapy. So she had a double mastectomy. She's had hysterectomy. She was on testosterone for a number of years, has some health complications as a result, and regret. So she's suing for this, and that's the first detransitioner lawsuit in Canada. Of course, the big one, Amy Hamm. I was going to mention James Cantor. So I covered the Amy Hamm hearings live on Twitter for 6 or 7 days in the last 2 weeks of her hearings to try and give a summary of what was going on. We had expert witnesses, Dr. James Cantor, formerly of the Canadian Association of Mental Health, CAMH clinic in Toronto, was giving expert testimony about all kinds of things, comorbid mental health issues, and etc. Very, very insightful. And we're hoping for a decision in the Amy Hamm case coming up in the new year. She was in hearings on trial is another way of phrasing this. More days than OJ was on trial for murder.
The more these things are in the news, the longer these things go, the more attention is paid to them. It's the Barbra Streisand effect again. I mean, more and more people are hearing about it, not just in Canada, but all over the world. These people are heroes, really, despite their sad stories or awful things happening to them.
Yep. The Barry Neufeld Supreme Court case was a sad decision, and that it's Supreme Court of Canada. It's the highest court of the land. They upheld Glenn Hansman's, who's former head of the BC Teachers Federation, that 70,000 strong union, and his malicious character attacks against Barry Neufeld, who was one of the first outspoken critics of SOGI curriculum. That's the sexual orientation and gender identity, package that was instituted in the BC education system going back six years ago. And the court upheld Hansman's right to defame Neufeld and attack his character in the interest of the intersectional minority. The historically oppressed need a champion, and Glenn Hansman, I guess, is the court-appointed bully. Yeah. What do we got? Oh, yeah.
Lovely.
Two things going on here.
My favorite.
With this theme, Faye Johnstone is an activist. I think he's from Ottawa. I always want to call him Brian, but
That's
it's something else.
That's the impression I get.
Zach.
Certainly been educated in Ottawa, certainly, naturalized, if not from.
Well, internationally, we had a couple things this year. There was a big controversy about the luxury brand Balenciaga, who had incorporated some gender identity politics into their branding, which also included BDSM, kink, and dog whistle to pedophiles in their advertising. Balenciaga took a big hit in the markets. Target, as we can see by this article, lost $15 billion in market capitalization. So that means people sold off their Target shares and dumped their Target shares, and the value of the stock went down to a cumulative total of about $15 billion for running their rainbow campaign during Pride Month and having, very questionable kinds of materials for kids in their stores. We had our own version in Canada, which is Faye here, who became the spokesperson for Hershey chocolate on International Women's Day. I ran an AI on this, figure out what people's opinion was of Faye Johnstone and what the broad public sentiment was. Unfortunately, more people than not were on the side of Johnstone.
Often you see a face and I can't believe that person ended up being a psychopath. That's crazy. They seemed so nice. They looked so normal. And honestly, Faye Johnstone gives me the worst kind of creeps. This person looks like they're evil and is actually evil. Like they are living up to their facial stereotype in all kinds of ways. Like this person has hate and blackness in their heart.
Well, he's
I am very surprised that most people were on Faye Johnstone's side.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hershey still took a big hit on this, but most people are on the virtue signaling side of the issue. Now, Johnstone has been quoted and tweeted. This tweet surfaces every time there's a Faye Johnstone controversy, and there are a few of them, about how he wants women to be so intimidated that they don't dare speak about transgender issues. And
I also have a video of I have a video that I need to post at some point that I found of Faye on YouTube at the 519 in one of their speeches saying the same sentiment. It's a clip of a longer talk amongst a panel of people. And Faye's basically saying how they must scare people, how they must intimidate people. And it's along the same sentiments, right? This idea of we need to shut those people up, we need to intimidate them, and we need to scare them. Yeah. Not an uncommon thing for Faye to do.
Well, that intimidation and overt incitement, we heard in that leaked union video as well. We want to put the fright in them. Now Faye, here's Faye, who's unambiguously male. I mean, when he wears tight pants like this, it's pretty obvious he's still got the kit.
I don't even think Faye's on. Well, I was going to say testosterone. I'm pretty sure that Faye is not even taking hormones, and I have no way of knowing this. I'm speculating, but I just have a feeling they have long hair and wear lipstick.
And a knife on your shirt saying "Protect Trans Kids." On your shirt. So this is the wholesome.
But these are the poor people that we have to protect because they're so noble and so marginalized, and people are, and look at those poor people in a wheelchair that, really put them at the front. We need to, they're just so noble.
Anyone who has questions about this kind of presentation in our public education system is clearly a bigot, and parents who are conservative and don't like this in books and in outside. Like Johnstone goes into schools and gives training.
Well, it's a colonialist white supremacist identity, right? So, are you a white supremacist? Because if you don't accept this, then you are. You really are. And you need to stop it. You need to stop being a conservative.
Yeah. This is the Pride Parade in Ottawa. Johnstone was the official marshal of the Pride Parade this year here in town. I've seen this drag queen on the
trans parade. I'm sure that was trans. It was specifically trans parade, wasn't it? Because the Pride Parade was in June. Am I messing it up? Am I mixed up?
No, you may be right. I mean, I get confused about all these days and all these parades and all these celebrations.
And you'd think that June is enough because they were all over the place all over June. But no, this was even not, I don't even think this was in June either. And it was like,
no, this was in August, Pride. I'm pretty sure.
It's right. It's the trans parade. So now we have to have whole trans areas. So that I thought was kind of fun too.
Yeah. Faye. I love the sausage bar. That's we have to be able to laugh at some of this stuff. And I think about I really enjoy our conversations, Melanie, and we frequently laugh. A lot of this stuff is
that's how I survive.
It's we need to have some laughter to get through some of these ridiculous and sometimes frightening and really heavy topics to talk about. Anyhow, we got some stuff moving this year. New Brunswick was a huge story, and that ties into some of the shifts in political policy as well. Now, New Brunswick, the policy was Policy 713 that Blaine Higgs has spoken out against. It was a policy drafted in schools that included keeping secrets from parents about change of social of pronouns, social transition, in the name of so-called protecting trans kids, and things like overnight camps where self-identified boys would be sleeping in girls' cabins and things like this. There was a bunch of stuff around 713. It was a set of policies that was drafted and implemented by two activist organizations without any accountability whatsoever. No inputs from outside. One of them is the Pi School, that's Soji Education. And they teach about anti-normativity and cis heterosexism and cisgenderism and all these new categories of oppressors, and they're mobilizing to along with Egale Canada, which is a national organization, to try and get the courts to take their side, to hold on to these things in terms of policy. But Blaine Higgs is, again, I saw an article today, expecting an election this year. He is staying the course on the issue of gender, and was the first elected politician in Canada to stand up and speak about this in any capacity.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, so it's nice to see that kind of movement.
That opened a floodgate.
Yes, almost right away. About the same time, we had this news story that came. This was from Rebel News. Drea Humphreys actually done some really great work this year. Fort Nelson, Saskatchewan School apologized for sexual materials given to students. This was a Planned Parenthood, an outside organization coming into a grade 9 classroom, bringing these materials with them, kids getting access to them. Oops, sorry. It was unintentional. It was a mistake. But there's a pattern of mistakes with these cards.
Yeah. The same
that
behavior
has cropped up. Yeah. And they just denied that they were doing anything. This was a sign that was on the right-hand side, put up in British Columbia early this year. Getawake.ca, which is a parents' organization, raising the question, what are kids really learning in schools? And if we are to look at what Planned Parenthood is doing, it's quite frightening. So Saskatchewan followed really closely. Scott Moe immediately put his foot down, banned all outside consulting groups and outside organizations from bringing content into the classrooms. They were doing an investigation into how these cards ended up in a class, and then very quickly cottoned on to this secret social transition thing that was happening, and ended up invoking the notwithstanding clause when a Saskatchewan organization and Egale Canada mobilized a legal challenge to uphold the secret policy.
that made those zealots real mad.
Very mad. Tories promise parental rights. Critics call it a dog whistle.
Yeah. What they fail to understand is it's parents' rights is just a term. They try to frame it like parents believe they own their children, but parents are stewards of their children's lives. They raise their children from birth. They're part of the family. They're related. I mean, if nothing else, we understand that related animals are much, much more prone to altruistic behavior towards their kin. And so all of a sudden, it's like we've forgotten that, or looking after your own children's interests and caring about your own children suddenly is a dog whistle. I cannot believe that a lot of people seem to be buying this. That's the crazy thing. It's not the zealots. The zealots are going to say whatever the zealots say. For me, it's still those people who are smarter than that, who sympathize with these ideas, who, because they're not thinking this through, they're being swept away along these arguments. Those are the people that I would like to reach in 2024, reach more people like that, and get them from stepping down from the crazy podium. That's what I'd like.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that came out, again, this was Leger polling, was that 78% of Canadians were against schools keeping secrets like this from parents. That 78, or almost 8 in 10 people was split a little more, saying that parents should be involved in the decision as well to socially transition. And, about half of that group was saying, well, parents need to be informed, but if there's going to be a social transition, then that's going to be on the kid and on the schools. So it did give us an indication that the majority of people aren't, going to push for these secret transitions. Only about 14% of the population said that schools should keep this secret, that it was, saving trans kids. Like the presumption here.
I can tell you, I don't know. I haven't done my own polling or my own data, but there are many people who are left-leaning who believe this stuff. They might not, when you drill down to it, no, they don't think there should be all this secret transitioning in schools, and they don't believe the more extreme aspects of it. But in a polite conversation, they'll have, but parents are abusive, and so it's really important not to out kids at school. there are a lot of people that are swayed by these arguments because they are not thinking through what's going on, and they're simply believing arguments that are being put out by legacy media. That I've encountered quite a bit.
Yeah.
Nice. This is my number one. The
Parents' marches.
Yeah. I want to have a big shout out to all the parents and non-parents, all the people who came out this year to protect children from the encroaching of this stuff in schools. People came out en masse throughout the summer, really. It seems to me that, yeah, it was really encouraging. So many people were willing to stick their head up. So many people I met said they'd never been to a protest before. It was their first one, that they really felt that they had to say something even if they didn't have children themselves. So shout out to everybody who decided to attend a march or a protest this summer. Well done. I'm very proud of you. This is my number one.
Yeah, we were talking before, Melanie, about your experience, and I'm trying to remember if it was this June the 9th experience.
It
about
was
the difference between how the media was portraying things on the ground and what was actually happening. So it was this one.
Yeah. So June 9th for me really was my coming out. This is story time for me. I got to a point where I felt I had to do something. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I'd noticed since, oh gosh, I think it must have been April, that there was this protest in Ottawa. And I was like, Ottawa's not that far. Should I just go? I don't know anybody. What am I going to do? And a lot of internal wrestling. What if I'm outed? What if my child knows? What if there's just a lot of what ifs, a lot of concerns, a lot of worries. And then I nearly didn't go because I was like, oh, I can't really justify it. I made up all kinds of excuses. And the night before I was like, sod it. I got into my car, I rented like the cheapest place I could find, and I just drove to Ottawa, and I had a great time. You know, I went to the first friendly face that I met, who happened to be Blueprint for Canada. Cheers, how's it going? And then I met a whole group of people that I've been working with so far. So it was a really great experience. But what I did notice is my experience at the protest was these were people who were genuinely concerned. There were some things at that protest that I wasn't so keen on seeing. But it wasn't the experience that was presented to me through some of the things that I'd been reading about. The trans activists were as crazy as I'd expected, if I'm going to be really honest. But the actual parents, no, it's very different kettle of fish. But afterwards, yes. So the media, there was actually quite a bit of media about this particular protest after June 9th. And it was very distorted. Not all of it. Some of it was pretty reflective of what was happening. But I noticed that the media, depending on, I guess, the political leaning, some of it seemed pretty fair and what I'd experienced, and other ones, which is, I guess, the CBC and like the legacy media, were lies. They were not at all what I saw. They were very ill-informed. I knew that there were lies in the media. I knew there was bias in the media, but it was the first time that I had experienced that firsthand. And it really woke me up to really what's going on with journalism and how far behind journalism has fell in terms of ethics and its duty to the public. But, you know, if you've been through it and you see that this happens, and I think a lot of people experience that on the Million Marches, that same awakening as to what's going on with our media here in Canada. For me, it energized me. I think it gave me even more of a purpose to do things like having this channel or having this podcast with you, Shannon, just making sure that we can bring out as much of the things that are going on as possible to people, right? Because we can't necessarily trust our media, and try to do a decent job while doing it as much as possible.
Yeah. And I think that, okay, so this was September the 20th on Parliament Hill. I did some live streaming on my Twitter while I was there, talking to lots of people. People came from all over. There was, gosh, I don't think 10,000 was out of the realm estimate of the crowd size here. This is
it was huge. It looked huge.
On Wellington Street. We are blocks and blocks of people on the street between basically on the sidewalk and the gate and the fence that is around Parliament Hill. And then there are thousands of more people up on the lawn, the parliamentary lawn. So we assembled here on Parliament Hill, and easily, I mean, 8 to 10 times the number of people on this side of the protest than on the other rainbow side of the protest. And the protesters there were led by Fred Hahn and Jagmeet Singh and a bunch of the usual Ottawa suspects who were out. And I got some heckling on my way, which was kind of fun.
I want to underline the craziness that the deputy prime minister? Is that what they're called? Is that what Jagmeet Singh is called?
No, he'd be. He's
It
not
would
even
be.
leader of the opposition. He's a leader of the NDP party.
So they're a coalition. But the point is, I mean, there's a pretty important guy. He's a pretty influential guy. You know, he's a mover and a shaker in the politics here in Canada. But the fact that this leader, this party leader that is in cahoots in leading the country currently, is at a protest against regular everyday citizens on the side of the 17% of those zealous activists. That to me is beyond insane. And I cannot believe that stuff like that does not get more coverage. It didn't get international coverage, that specific aspect. Not really, not that I remember. And to me, that was insane, because imagine that happening 10 years ago. Like, unreal. Yeah, it was a very surreal experience watching Jagmeet Singh behind those banners, basically calling parents and regular citizens. These were normal, regular people coming out saying, please don't sexualize childhood. And they were being denounced by Jagmeet Singh.
It still shocks me. I mean, that was one of the experiences that I had a couple of years ago. So just jumping back here, this is you and Billboard Chris and Chris Dacey in the red hat. Dacey has a sort of a platform.
No, that's not Chris Dacey. That is what's his name? I think his name is Brett. I think he's a Freedom Convoy person. I think.
Yeah, he's from the Maritimes.
Looks kind of like Dacey, but not. Yeah,
he's got a good sized following. Of course, there's you, and the three of you and the group behind you are walking down the same street that Chris and Chanel Fall and I walked down in 2021. And you talk about these political leaders mobilizing, like Jagmeet Singh. Well, we had Joel Harden.
Oh, yes.
Right. Joel Harden is a member of provincial parliament here in Ottawa. This was in his riding where this protest took place. Joel Harden, we had Catherine McKenney, they, them, from Ottawa City Councillor. Yeah, well, this was the June 9th, but in 2021 at the same location, these political actors mobilized their constituents and used their platforms to leverage media to bring out hundreds of people to protest and intimidate three of us. It's as far as I'm concerned, it's a kind of a gross abuse of their power.
It's politicians acting against their own citizens. That's what gets me, right? It's already kind of weird that you have politicians protesting, period, about anything, but to do it against your own citizens, the utter brashness, I cannot even put in words how I feel about how immoral, unethical that really is. I think it shows a true disdain for your own citizens that you happen to disagree with, that you're willing to do that. I think it shows poor leadership. I think it shows poor moral compass, frankly.
We still get some of these arguments about Pierre Poilievre, and someone tried this on me recently while he was out there talking to the truckers. He's a political leader. He might not agree with everybody that he talks to, but it's his job
there's a difference
to talk
between
to people.
Speaking to people and protesting against them. I think there's a difference.
Right.
Now, I'm not a supporter of Poilievre. I'm not a hater of Poilievre. I'm sort of indifferent on this person, but there is a difference between having conversations and trying to understand where people are coming from and picketing them, actually actively picketing them, to me.
Well, these zealous activists obviously feel that it's completely inappropriate if you don't agree with somebody for a politician to even talk to them. So we're gonna disenfranchise constituents in Canada because they have different political views than us. We're in a mess.
Well, they're telling you that they're not going to listen to you. We're absolutely not going to listen to you. We don't care about what you say. In fact, we're going to actively try to use tactics against you. Politicians saying that. Anyway, again, a whole other conversation for another time. I'm sure we could talk about this a long time about issues around protesting citizens within their own country.
Speaking of Pierre Poilievre, before even the September 20th marches, as the Million March for Children or the Hands Off Our Kids March or whatever you want to call it was mobilizing, it captured the imagination of people across the country. And it certainly did capture the attention of people in the Conservative Party at their national convention in Quebec City in early September. I think it was September the 9th. There was a number of different policy proposals that were put forward, voted on by members of the Conservative Party, and elevated in stature. And a bunch of them had to do with gender ideology. So Coach Linda Blade, former Olympic athlete in heptathlon, if I'm getting the word right, and athletic coach who also testified at Amy Hamm's trial, was instrumental in leading some of these policy adoptions. The Conservative leadership, Pierre Poilievre, doesn't have to make these part of his campaign platform. They don't have to be even part of his talking points, but it is now very much on the record that the Conservative base is supports overwhelmingly stopping the medicalization of children, keeping men out of women's prisons, having some kind of boundaries around self-ID laws, and getting cheating men out of women's sports. So really big on the policy side. It was long awaited. I'd attended two conferences, or a conference 2 years in a row called. It used to be the Manning Center for Public Policy, but it is now the Canada Strong and Free Network, which is kind of an equivalent to a conservative convention. The topic about gender was huge. Outside of the talking points, outside of the press releases, and outside of what the media is writing, the people at these conferences, this was a forefront topic of concern, and it's nice to see it moving in policy. Then we had Alberta follow with their convention not that long ago. Premier Daniel Smith speaking to parents' rights, primary caregivers. We basically had these statements now come from, Daniel Smith in Alberta, Scott Moe in Saskatchewan. Unfortunately, the Conservatives voted out in Manitoba, but the former premier there was talking about parents' rights and these secrets issues in Manitoba. The Ed Minister in Ontario and the Premier have talked out against indoctrination. Haven't passed the policies yet. Quebec has a tribunal that has a 2-year mandate to investigate these things and write a report on them objectively. And then we've got, of course, New Brunswick and Blaine Higgs. So this year was huge in terms of policy moves. I think Higgs was like he was not the canary in the coal mine, really. Maybe the penguin on the edge of the cliff.
He's the drop that overflowed the glass.
Yeah. So we've had big change in the policy environment. It's been one of the major themes this year. It's finally kind of got official status in Canada as an issue. It's getting harder and harder to suppress conversation about this and call everybody a conservative.
The more angry the progressive leftists become, and the more they double down into their insane ways of imposing their worldview, the more press it gets, the more people who used to think this was perfectly sensible drop out or drop out of supporting these things. I think, as Billboard Chris says, if you just stand there and let them show you who you are, eventually they will.
Around the world, we're getting all kinds of stuff. A couple of these, one of these is 2022. Leah Thomas was banned from swimming in women's events. Leah was the UPenn swimmer that was swimming against Riley Gaines in national competitions, took away medals. In 2023, we saw just recently Riley Gaines's medals have been restored and stripped from Leah Thomas, and the records reestablished, and she was awarded $1.2 million in damages. She's run a very, very successful awareness campaign against cheating men in women's sports. We had the green bar there in the middle of the screen is from the British Medical Journal, which in February of this year published a scathing report about the lack of evidence around puberty blockers. Around the world, we have England, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, France. The Medical Association has made statements against gender ideology. There's actually, we thought Germany was like really quite rigidly captured by these ideologues, but there was some information that's come out in the last 10 days about gender critical policy being tabled and discussed, and concerns being expressed and heard by politicians. And in the last week, as I jump to the next slide, this was very unexpected. But Australia and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists has said, we're not endorsing first-line gender-affirming care. We're endorsing therapy. So it's a no to puberty blockers. I mean, the house of cards that is gender ideology around the world is collapsing rapidly. Canada is unfortunately the outlier. Right?
Yeah.
Australia was pretty bad. They were taking kids away from parents who weren't affirming, kind of like California is doing.
I
But
feel like maybe our human rights have something to do with that. And that may be the last bastion that we have to conquer, or the last mountain we need to climb to get to some of this insanity.
yeah,
But we'll see.
this was internationally again. These are the I guess the flyover states, but these are the states in the U.S. that have passed laws against gender affirming care for children and puberty blockers and things like that. The legislative season in the U.S. at the state level is very short.
Yeah, these would
Takes
be the
place in
states where the trans genocide is occurring.
and so there's been just in the last year big changes in how these things are being addressed in the U.S. Our progressive prime minister shows no signs any kind of concession to the concerns of now most Canadians who are aware of this. So that's kind of like that's the international perspective, the things that have gone on in the last year. And I wanted to look forward a little bit. You mentioned the human rights piece, Melanie, and I think it is something we need to
Something
overcome.
big to think about. It seems to be something that makes Canada very special in terms of the tenacity at which it's willing to cling on to unreal. When I say unreal, I mean not in a basis in reality way of looking at the world and forcing other people to adopt it, or else consequences, right? Personal and professional consequences.
I've been thinking a lot about this human rights thing. You know, we have seen a bunch of language stuff. This is something that's come to our attention in the last couple of weeks. It was a toolkit that was released in Ontario for educators, and it's all of this progressive, zealous activist material, decolonial.
It is all of the hits, absolutely all of the hits that you could possibly think of in terms of intersectionality, in terms of Marxist theory, in terms of hating parents, in terms of, strategies. Oh, hating religious people, especially the Christians. I mean, this document, or both of these documents, have been, well, for me, an absolute pleasure to go through, because it is handing to any reader proof that all of these conspiracy theorists are, again, correct.
These reports have confirmed every single one of the concerns expressed by parents: the alienation by the schools, the triangulation between schools and children and parents, the overt hostility towards traditional beliefs, be they religious or simple, conservative middle Canadians. And they use the common buzzwords that we're starting to wake up that these are twisted meanings, right? These are coded meanings. They're Orwellian words like the Ministry of Peace is responsible for war. Yeah. So, when these policy people are using words like unsafe or harm or human rights, these are all words that have double meanings. Safety means that someone's beliefs might be questioned, and harms mean that, again, someone's belief might be questioned, and they might have feelings that are uncomfortable. The money behind these research projects, like there's $140,000 in funding, federal government provided funding for these toolkits. My hope is that next year we figure out that human rights that's used as a buzzword is really one of those manipulations of language, and it's designed, when someone claims something's a human right, if you say no it's not, you get this wild reaction.
In this document, but not just this document, it seems to be a running theme that we must teach these specific kind of ideologies as though they're just fact because of human rights. It seems to be something that is used a lot, certainly is used in this document. I think that's going to be one aspect of what we'll be exploring. I think we're going to be spending a lot of time in the new year looking into how to dissect information for those people. First of all, I highly encourage you to go read it yourself. But if you don't, or if you can't for whatever reason, we're currently speaking about how we can sort of put together some exploratory videos on different topics for you and to explore this particular toolkit, because it really does encompass a lot of the topics that we talk about here on Gender Wars Report, really.
Well, if we look at the last year and we look at the last couple of years and how far we've come, there have been a few people who've been banging this drum for quite a while. We saw Megan Murphy in Toronto not long ago, and she's been gender critical since before 2016. And, Jordan Peterson has been speaking about this issue since 2016. The big attacks on him were by the trans mob when he was speaking out against the pronoun bill, C-16. And more people are joining in. And all those people, that we talked about out at the parents' protests all had the same kind of opportunity to see the difference between the media representation and narrative of the world and what's actually happening on the ground, and to recognize that, hey, wait a second, we're not getting represented accurately here. We're being demonized and or not reported at all. And this is causing all kinds of problem.
Well, that is a super fun way of concluding our episode today. And I wanted to close up in my own way. I realized that you and I have used to spend a lot of time thinking how we could keep this a half hour long. And it occurred to me yesterday that, that half hour in the few months that we've been working on these together went from half hour to 45 minutes. And then it went from 45 minutes to an hour, these episode lengths. And then that went from an hour to an hour and a half. And now we're nearing 2 hours. So I think we need to work on maybe being more concise in 2024. That's going to be my resolution. I'm going to make one today, and that's going to be my resolution. Maybe chopping up some of these videos. But yeah, it occurred to me these videos are just getting longer and longer and longer.
And we really covered an awful lot of ground from this year. And I hope that viewers appreciate it. I'm curious if there's anything we missed. Like, is there a standout story that we didn't get in our list? I'd love to hear from you in the comments about that. And what are your hopes for the coming year? What's the big thing that you think needs to have a breakthrough for us to really move the needle on this? And make sure also that you like and subscribe.
All right. Have a happy new year, everybody. And have a great 2024. Thank you so much for watching. It's been an eye-opening year for sure. Click on one of these suggestions for some other stories in the gender landscape in Canada. Hope you like them.